August 23, 1945, Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. She noticed the smell before she saw the fence. It reached her in a thin, almost careless wave carried on the late summer air. Not the sharp sting of disinfectant she had braced for. Not sweat oil or fear. This was softer, clean, almost domestic. Soap. Her steps slowed without her meaning to. The gravel beneath her shoes crunched unevenly too loud in the sudden quiet of her attention. She drew a breath again cautiously as if the smell might disappear if she acknowledged it. Soap did not belong to this moment. Soap belonged to kitchens, to mornings, to hands washed before meals. She had crossed an ocean expecting something else. The bus door hissed open behind her. Metal sighed. Somewhere a man coughed. The line of women shuffled forward one after another, their shoulders rounded, their eyes trained ahead. She followed because stopping would draw attention, and attention she had learned was dangerous. The fence appeared only afterward, tall, orderly, stretching farther than she could immediately measure. Barbed wire caught the sun and returned it in small, indifferent flashes. Guard towers stood at even intervals, their silhouettes clean against a wide, pale sky. Arkansas looked nothing like the pictures she carried in her head. She had imagined darker ground, tighter spaces, shadows pressed close together. Instead, there was distance here, space between buildings, air that moved freely, and the smell of soap. As she stepped down from the bus, something else slipped into her awareness. Sound, not shouted commands, not boots striking pavement in unison. Music. It came from somewhere she couldn't see, at first faint but steady like a thread running beneath everything else. A radio. Midday, judging by the angle of the sun and the languid pace of the tune. Brass and strings light, almost cheerful. She did not recognize the song, but she recognized the feeling it carried. Ordinary. Unbothered. As if no one nearby expected the world to end. Her fingers tightened around the strap of the small cloth bag she carried. Everything she still owned fit inside it. A change of underclothes, a comb, a folded scrap of paper with an address she wasn't sure still existed. The women ahead of her slowed near a low wooden building. Someone opened a door. Hinges creaked. The sound was familiar enough to make her chest ache. A towel hung just inside, draped casually over a nail. Thick, cotton. White once, though, now dulled by repeated washing. She stared at it too long. The towel did not belong here either. Her thoughts lagged behind her body. She was still in the place she had left, still under gray skies, still listening to speeches, still memorizing what Americans were supposed to be. Loud, careless, brutal, undisciplined, a people who relied on machines because they lacked control. She had believed this because belief had been safer than doubt. A man stood by the door. American uniform, olive drab. The fabric looked worn but clean, the creases softened by use rather than neglect. He glanced at the line, then stepped back half a pace. He waited. It took her a moment to understand that he was waiting for her. Her feet stopped again. She had not planned to stop. Her body simply refused to move forward while her mind tried to catch up with the shape of the moment. The man nodded, once small, almost apologetic, and held the door wider. She passed him. No hand touched her. No voice hurried her along. The doorway did not swallow her. It opened. Inside, the air was cooler. Wood underfoot instead of concrete. A row of simple benches lined one wall, their surfaces smooth where countless hands must have rested. On a table near the window sat a stack of enamel cups, pale blue with dark rims. One had a small chip along the edge. She noticed that too. Why would a prison need chipped cups? Somewhere down the room, the radio was louder now. Amon's voice spoke between songs, relaxed, unhurried, as if speaking to friends rather than an audience. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. No urgency. Her stomach tightened. This was wrong. Every instinct she carried told her this calm was staged, that kindness, if it appeared at all, was a prelude. She reminded herself to watch, to memorize details, to store them away for later when the trick revealed itself. A woman beside her shifted her sleeve, brushing against her arm. The contact was light accidental, yet it made her flinch. She realized how tightly she was holding herself, how every muscle remained prepared for impact that had not come. Another American stood near the bench's clipboard, tucked under his arm. He glanced up then, back down, making a small mark with his pencil. He did not look at her face for long. He did not stare. Across the room, a window stood open. Outside, she could see actual grass, not the trampled mud she expected. It moved gently in the breeze. A smell of sun-warmed wood drifted in, mixing with soap and something faintly metallic she could not place. She tried to remember what she had been told this moment would feel like. Fear, certainly. Pain, likely. The sharp humiliation of being reduced to a number. Instead, she felt disoriented. The propaganda in her head searched for purchase and found none. It slid off the surfaces of what she saw: the towel, the cups, the radio, the way the man at the door had stepped aside without being asked. Another small thing happened. Someone behind her dropped something, a button perhaps. It struck the floor with a dry click and rolled beneath a bench. Before she could react, an American bent down, retrieved it, and handed it back without a word. Their fingers did not touch. She took the button because it was offered, because refusing would have required explanation, and explanation required energy she did not yet have. Her palm closed around it. The metal was warm. No one was watching her closely. No one demanded gratitude. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, leaving nothing behind but a faint unease she could not name. She became aware then of how quiet her own breathing was, how she had learned to make herself small without realizing it. The room did not reward this skill. It did not punish it either. A guard near the far wall shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking softly. He glanced at the radio, then at his watch. Noon, perhaps? Lunch approaching? The thought arrived unbidden, and she pushed it away. Food was another promise that had always come with conditions. She lifted her eyes once more to the towel by the door. It swayed slightly when someone passed, moving as if alive. Clean, ordinary, unremarkable. This was not what prisoners were supposed to smell like. The thought formed clearly without emotion, as if stated for the record. She did not yet ask what it meant. She only knew that something was already wrong, and that whatever came next would not follow the rules she had been given. She waited for the correction. It did not come. The towel by the door kept swaying gently, settling back into stillness. The radio drifted into another song. Someone laughed, not loudly, not carelessly, but the low, brief sound of a man amused by something small. The world continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. That she realized was what frightened her most. If this were cruelty, she would recognize it. Cruelty followed rules. It announced itself. It gave her something solid to brace against. But this quiet normality offered no edges, nothing to push back on. Her mind reached backward, searching for structure. She remembered the lecture hall, the smell of chalk dust, the officer's voice steady and precise as he explained the nature of the enemy. America, he had said, was loud, chaotic, a nation without discipline, stitched together by money and machines rather than belief. Their soldiers were poorly trained, their morality weak. They relied on excess because they lacked control. She had written it down. Everyone had. There were posters, too. Thick-limbed caricatures, faces twisted into crude smiles, films that showed American soldiers chewing gum while firing wildly, laughing as they destroyed what others had built. The message had been consistent, whatever else they were. Americans were not serious people. Serious people did not build camps like this. She stood near one of the benches, unsure whether sitting would be permitted. No sign instructed her either way. No voice told her to wait or move. The absence of command pressed against her chest. In the camps, she had known uncertainty was dangerous. Orders arrived constantly, even when unnecessary, because order itself was proof of strength. Here, strength seemed to take a different shape. An American passed behind her carrying a crate. He set it down with care, aligning it neatly with the others. He wiped his hands on his trousers and said something to another man nearby. They exchanged a few words, about the heat, perhaps, or the weight of the box. Their voices were conversational, familiar. They did not lower their tone around the prisoners. They did not raise it either. She watched closely. Americans, she had been told, did not work like this. They were sloppy, impatient. They barked and moved on. These men did neither. They worked steadily with an economy of motion that suggested long habit. One lifted, another steadied. A third adjusted the placement by an inch and nodded when it was right. No one claimed credit. No one shouted instructions to prove authority. This, too, unsettled her. Kindness, she reminded herself, was often a strategy, a way to soften resistance before tightening control. She had seen it used. She had been taught to use it. Smile first, reassure, then demand. Her shoulders tensed as she waited for the demand. A door opened farther down the room. Light spilled across the floor, revealing dust motes hanging in the air. Outside, she caught a glimpse of the camp beyond. More wooden buildings spaced evenly with paths worn smooth between them. A group of American soldiers crossed the yard, their movements unhurried. One carried a folded jacket over his shoulder. Another had his sleeves rolled up, forearms browned by sun. Farmhands, she thought suddenly. The idea arrived without invitation. She pushed it away, then let it return. The way they stood, the way they handled weight, the way they conserved effort. She had grown up among men who spoke of land but rarely touched it. Maps, plans, quotas. These Americans looked like men who knew the feel of soil, the pull of tools, the difference between work done for show and work done because it needed doing. That was not how enemies were supposed to look. She shifted her stance, testing the floor beneath her feet. The wood was solid, maintained. Someone had cared enough to replace a warped board rather than ignore it. A voice near the door called out, not sharply, not with command, but as one might call to a neighbor across a field. Another voice answered. A question, a response. Work continued. No one yelled. Her pulse quickened. This was another inconsistency she could not resolve. In her experience, authority announced itself through volume. Orders were meant to be heard over distance, over doubt. Silence meant weakness. Here, silence seemed to mean trust. She did not trust it. Her thoughts returned to the moment at the door, the way the man had stepped aside. That had been wrong too. In her world, movement through space reflected hierarchy. Doors were passed through in order. Someone always went last. She had gone first. The memory irritated her now. Not because it had frightened her, but because it had confused her. Confusion made her careless. Carelessness led to mistakes. She tightened her grip on the bag at her side, grounding herself in its familiar weight. This was temporary, she told herself. A phase. The Americans would reveal themselves soon enough. They always did. Across the room, one of the soldiers set down his clipboard and stretched, rolling his shoulders as if easing a familiar ache. He glanced at the radio and smiled faintly when a song ended. There was no one there to see him smile. The expression faded as easily as it had appeared. That, she thought, was dangerous too. Unperformed emotion. She studied their faces more closely now. They were not young boys flushed with excitement, nor old men hardened into cruelty. Most looked like something in between. Ordinary, weathered. The kind of faces that blended into crowds. Men like these, she realized with a jolt, had not come to war to be seen. That thought lodged itself uncomfortably in her mind. She had been taught that America's strength lay in spectacle parades, slogans, noise. But this place ran on routines so unremarkable they almost disappeared. Someone swept a corner. Someone stacked cups. Someone adjusted a window latch that rattled in the breeze. None of it looked like conquest. The radio announcer spoke again, his voice carrying through the room. A mention of weather, perhaps. She caught the word afternoon and felt a strange tightening in her throat. Afternoons had meaning here. They were named, expected. Time, she realized, moved differently in this place. In the world she had come from, time was something to be survived. Days blurred together under pressure measured by alarms and orders. Here time seemed planned, lived inside. She did not like that either. Her fear sharpened, taking on a new edge. This was not the fear of immediate harm. This was the fear of erosion, of beliefs wearing thin under the pressure of details too small to fight. She wanted the Americans to shout, to threaten, to restore the story she understood. They did not oblige. A guard approached the benches and gestured, not commanding, merely indicating that they should sit. His hand moved in a smooth arc, inclusive rather than directive. He waited for them to comply, his weight resting evenly on both feet. She sat because everyone else did. The bench was cool beneath her palms. No one corrected her posture. As the women settled, she caught fragments of conversation between the Americans. A mention of a farm back home, a brother working in a factory up north, a town name she did not recognize spoken with casual familiarity. Small towns, she thought, places where people knew each other, where work was shared and noticed. She had been told Americans were individuals to the point of chaos. What she saw instead were people shaped by communities, by habits formed long before uniforms. The realization made her uneasy in a way she could not articulate. If this was how they lived, then cruelty would not come easily to them. And if cruelty did not come easily, then perhaps it was not cruelty she should fear most. Perhaps it was something else. The thought remained unfinished as footsteps approached. The same man who had held the door earlier stopped nearby. He glanced down the row, counting softly under his breath, then nodded once satisfied. He did not look at her when he finished. As he walked away, she felt the faint, unwelcome stirring of another thought, one she refused to name, that whatever she had been prepared to endure, this was something entirely different. The first crack appeared on a morning that looked exactly like every other. That was what made it dangerous. The air was already warm when she stepped outside the sun, climbing without hurry the yard, still holding the cool of night in its shadows. She had slept poorly, her body waking, before her thoughts braced for something that never quite arrived. Around her the camp moved into its day with an efficiency that did not draw attention to itself. Work was assigned without ceremony. No whistles, no shouting. Names were read, groups formed, people moved. She was sent with a small detail to carry supplies from one building to another, tools boxes, nothing remarkable. The kind of task designed to fill hours rather than test strength. She accepted the crate placed in her arms, its weight familiar, its edges rough against her forearms. Halfway across the yard, the heat pressed harder. She felt it gather behind her eyes, a dull pressure she tried to ignore. Stopping would mean notice, and notice still felt unsafe. Her grip slipped. The crate tilted just enough to unbalance her. She caught it, but the effort sent a sharp pulse through her wrist. She swallowed and kept walking. Someone beside her slowed. An American older than most she had seen so far, hair already thinning beneath his queue, reached out without looking directly at her. His hands closed around the crate's edge, steadying it. "Switch," he said, not loudly. Just the word. She hesitated. The pause was brief but visible. He waited. They exchanged loads without ceremony. No comment, no glance toward anyone else. He took the heavier side as if it were nothing more than a practical adjustment. They walked on. It took several steps before she realized what had happened. That he had not corrected her, had not explained, had not framed the exchange as instruction or kindness. He had simply noticed a problem and solved it. Her pulse quickened. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to alarm. This was not how favors were usually given. There was no weight attached to it, no expectation. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He walked as before, breathing evenly, the crate resting against his hip. His attention remained forward. No audience. That detail mattered more than she wanted it to. Later, as the morning wore on, another small thing happened. A woman near her stumbled, coughing, her face pale beneath the rising heat. She bent forward slightly, one hand on her knee, trying to catch her breath without stopping entirely. An American guard noticed. He did not call out. He did not signal for help. He walked over, removed his canteen, and held it out. The woman drank. Slowly, carefully. When she finished, he took the canteen back, screwed the cap on, and returned to his place. No one spoke of it again. She found herself replaying the moment long after it passed. There had been no flourish, no command to stand down, no reminder of authority, just water offered where it was needed. If this was manipulation, it was the strangest kind she had ever encountered. At midday, the work paused. The radio in the distance shifted tone voices, overlapping briefly before settling into music again. People moved toward shade, toward tables set beneath open structures that caught the breeze. She sat where she was told. The bench creaked softly under her weight. Food arrived in plain containers, ladled without comment. Portions were even. No one received more because of rank. No one was made to wait because of pride. She watched closely. The Americans ate without urgency, without ceremony. They did not speak about the food itself. No boasting. No reverence. Eating appeared to be what one did between tasks, not an event that required acknowledgement. This, too, unsettled her. In her experience, food had always carried meaning. Scarcity sharpened it. Power controlled it. Here, food seemed assumed. She lifted her spoon, paused, then ate. No one watched. Across the table, two Americans spoke quietly about a broken fence near the edge of the camp. One mentioned that it reminded him of something back home, a section of wire that always gave way after heavy rain. The other nodded, adding that his father would have fixed it twice before breakfast. They laughed, not loudly, not for effect. The sound passed and was gone. She did not understand all the words, but she understood the rhythm. This was not nostalgia. It was reference, a shared language of work. She thought of the men who were missing from these conversations. 12 million she had heard, though no one here spoke the number aloud. Men sent away, not replaced by spectacle, but by absence. Farms run short-handed, factories humming through long shifts, people doing what needed doing because no one else would. She began to see it everywhere once she noticed how tasks were divided, not by status but by ability. How tools were shared, passed from hand to hand without comment. How a problem was addressed by the nearest capable person rather than escalated. In the afternoon, she struggled with a latch on one of the storage doors. The metal caught scraping instead of sliding cleanly into place. She tried again, slower this time, applying pressure where she thought it might help. It did not. An American walked past, then stopped. He turned back, examining the latch without asking permission. He knelt, adjusted something small with his fingers, then tested it. The door closed smoothly. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and continued on his way. She stared at the door for a moment longer than necessary. This was not kindness as she understood it. It was maintenance. No one had thanked him. He had not waited to be thanked. The thought struck her with quiet force. This place did not run on gestures. It ran on habits. As the day wore down, she felt something unfamiliar settle over her. Not relief, not trust. Something closer to observation without tension. She noticed the way people moved around one another, adjusting paths without collision. The way voices rose and fell without dominance. At one point, she realized she had stopped bracing for impact. The realization frightened her enough to bring the tension back. That evening, as the light softened and shadows stretched long across the yard, someone called the end of the workday. Tools were returned, crates stacked, water shared again casually as if thirst were an expected condition rather than a weakness. She sat on the bench, her back aching, her hands marked by the day's labor. Nearby, an American removed his gloves and set them aside. The fabric was worn thin at the fingers. Without looking at her, he pushed them across the bench. "For tomorrow," he said. She stared at the gloves, then at him. "They're too big," she said, surprising herself by speaking at all. He shrugged. Better than nothing. And that was all. He stood and walked away, already focused on something else. She picked up the gloves. They smelled faintly of leather and sweat and something else she could not place. Work, perhaps, or sun. She held them for a long moment, then folded them carefully and placed them in her bag. Not because she had been told to, not because someone might notice, because she did not know what else to do with something that had been given without being offered. That night, lying on her cot, she replayed the day in fragments. The crate, the water, the latch, the gloves. None of it dramatic. None of it memorable in the way danger was memorable. And yet she could not assemble these moments into the shape she expected. There was no pattern of reward or punishment, no tightening of rules, no unveiling of threat, only people doing what needed to be done. The thought followed her into sleep, unwelcome and persistent. If no one was trying to impress her, then whatever this was, it was real, and she did not yet know what to do with that. It happened on a day that should have passed without distinction. She woke with the weight of the gloves still in her bag, their borrowed usefulness pressing against her thoughts. The routine had settled enough to dull the edges of fear without removing it. That she had learned was when vigilance mattered most. The morning air carried a different scent. She noticed it as she stepped outside the way one notices weather before looking up. It lingered low and warm, threaded through the yard with a confidence that startled her. Not soap this time. Not dust. Meat. The realization arrived too quickly. Her body reacted before her mind could intervene. Her stomach tightening as if struck. She stood still, the gravel biting into the soles of her shoes, and breathed again to be certain. There was no mistaking it. Fat and heat. Smoke. The deep, unmistakable smell of something being cooked slowly without hurry. She swallowed and forced her feet to move. The sound followed iron against iron, the faint sizzle that rose and fell like breath. Somewhere nearby, a door opened and closed. A voice spoke easy, familiar, using words meant for cooperation rather than command. She felt herself pulling inward as if bracing against a blow that would not come. The work assignment passed in a blur. She lifted when told set down, when indicated. Her hands performed their tasks without instruction, the muscles remembering what the mind resisted. All the while, the smell persisted, weaving itself through every thought she tried to hold on to. By midday, it grew impossible to ignore. The meal area was already active when she arrived. Containers opened, steam lifted, bread appeared, real bread, thick sliced the crust catching light where it had been cut. She stared at it longer than she meant to. The bread did not belong here either. She took her place at the table, her movements careful practiced. The spoon rested in her hand, heavier than it should have felt. Across from her, an American tore his bread in half without thinking, used it to catch what remained on his plate, and continued a conversation about a machine that had broken down earlier that morning. He spoke of it the way one speaks of weather. Inconvenient. Temporary. She listened not to the words, but to the ease with which they were delivered. The meat was placed before her. Not ceremoniously. Not as a test. just another portion set down with the same attention given to every other plate. She did not touch it, her eyes fixed instead on the grain of the table beneath her fingertips. The wood bore marks of small cuts, darkened patches where oil had soaked in over time. This table had served many meals. It would serve many more. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she was not there. She was in a kitchen that no longer existed, the walls blackened by smoke long since settled into the brick. Her mother stood at the counter slicing bread thinner each week, her hands moving with a precision born of necessity. Meat had disappeared first, butter soon after. Bread followed slowly, its presence becoming uncertain enough to require planning. She saw her father at the table counting not calories but days. Saw the way he had learned to chew more slowly to make the act of eating last. A letter arrived in her memory without warning. She had received it weeks before, capture the paper soft from having been unfolded and refolded too many times. The writing had grown smaller, tighter, as if space itself were rationed. Her mother had not complained. She never did. She had simply written, "We are managing." Managing had meant soup stretched thin enough to see the bottom of the pot. Managing had meant silence where there had once been conversation. She opened her eyes. The meat steamed quietly in front of her. Someone across the table said something unremarkable, a sentence that carried no weight of intention. "We got plenty today," he remarked, glancing at the serving area. "Guess the shipment came in early." The words landed with a force she did not expect. Plenty. The room did not change. No one looked at her. No one noticed the way her breath caught sharp and shallow. The spoon trembled once in her hand before she set it down. She pushed her chair back and stood. No one stopped her. She walked away from the table, her steps measured, controlled. She did not run. Running would have drawn attention. She moved as one moved when performing an expected task, her body carrying her past familiar points, the bench, the door, the towel, that still hung where it always did. Outside, the light struck her eyes too brightly. She turned away from it and kept walking her path unobserved because no one was watching closely. She found a narrow space behind one of the storage buildings where the ground sloped slightly and weeds grew unchecked. The smell of meat reached her even here, softened by distance, but still present a reminder that could not be escaped. She leaned against the wall and slid down until she was seated on the ground. Only then did her control fail her. The tears came without sound, at first her body tightening to contain them as if noise itself were dangerous. Her shoulders shook once then again. She pressed her face into her hands, breathing through her fingers, trying to regain command over something, anything. This was not defeat. She had known defeat. Defeat was loud. It came with orders and collapse and the unmistakable clarity of loss. This was something else. This was the slow, careful dismantling of certainty. She cried because the story she had carried could not survive this place, because the enemy she had been taught to fear did not behave like an enemy at all, because she was full when she should not have been while those she loved were not. The injustice of it hollowed her out. Her tears darkened the dirt beneath her palms. She did not wipe them away. There was no one to see, and the effort felt pointless. She thought of fields she had never seen stretching farther than the eye could reach, of barns and silos and rail cars moving through the night, of hands that harvested and packed and shipped without pause, feeding not just those who wore the same uniform but anyone who happened to be within reach. She had not been taught this version of power. Power, she had learned, was about control, about deprivation wielded deliberately, about scarcity enforced as discipline. Here power seemed to take the form of continuity, of systems that kept moving regardless of who stood in the way, of food that arrived not as a message but as a fact. She pressed her forehead against her knees and let the thought finish itself. If this abundance was real, if it was not a trick, then everything she had believed about the balance of the world was wrong. The crying slowed, eventually giving way to a deep, aching exhaustion. She sat there long after the tears had stopped, listening to the distant sounds of the camp continuing without her. Tools clinked. A voice called out, not sharply, and received an answer. Life went on. When she finally stood, her legs protested stiff from the ground. She brushed dirt from her trousers with hands that still trembled slightly. Her face felt tight, the skin beneath her eyes swollen. She took a breath and steadied herself before stepping back into view. No one asked where she had been. The meal area had thinned. Plates were stacked. Someone wiped down the tables, the motion efficient and unremarkable. The smell of meat faded as the iron cooled, replaced by the familiar scent of wood and sun. She retrieved her bag and felt the gloves inside folded as she had left them. As she walked back toward the barracks, she noticed details she had not allowed herself to see before. The way supplies were organized for ease rather than inspection. The way paths were worn by use, not command. The way people spoke of tomorrow as something assumed, not hoped for. That night, she lay awake long after the lights dimmed. The world she had been given no longer fit the evidence of her senses. And the evidence, relentless in its ordinariness, did not yield to denial. Somewhere beyond the camp, machines ran. Fields were tended, trains moved, people ate, and here she was a prisoner learning that hunger was not a universal condition, that scarcity was not the natural state of things. The thought did not comfort her. It terrified her, because if this was true, then the war had not only been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost long before in the quiet spaces where abundance had been mistaken for weakness and restraint for naivety. She turned onto her side, staring into the dark. The question formed without words, heavy and unavoidable. If this was what America had been, what, she wondered, would it choose to become next? She expected the camp to change after that day. She waited for rules to tighten, for faces to harden, for the quiet balance she had observed to snap back into something recognizable. In her experience, moments of excess were always followed by correction. Kindness, once revealed, was usually withdrawn. None of that happened. Morning arrived as it always did. The same light, the same measured movement, the same radio voice floating faintly through open air, neither celebratory nor grim. The same men and women stepping into their tasks without comment. No one mentioned the meal. No one mentioned her absence. No one asked if she was all right. The world did not react to her breakdown. That, she slowly realized, was the point. She moved through the next days with a new awareness, not alertness exactly, but clarity. The tension that had once sharpened every interaction dulled into something steadier. She was no longer bracing for a reveal. There was nothing to reveal. This was simply how things were done. At breakfast, she noticed how food appeared on the table without discussion. Portions were consistent. Seconds were offered when available, not as reward, but as matter-of-fact extension. No one spoke of rations or sacrifice. The absence of commentary struck her more than abundance ever had. At lunch, she sat beside an American who ate quietly, his attention split between his plate and a list of tasks he recited aloud to no one in particular. He crossed off items as he remembered them. When he finished, he folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. "You got the door latch working?" he asked, glancing toward the storage building. "Yes," she answered. "Good," he said, and returned to his meal. That was the end of it. The exchange lingered with her long after the plates were cleared. There had been no praise, no suspicion, no need to frame the question as cooperation between captor and captive. The task had existed. It had been completed. That was enough. She began to see this pattern everywhere. Work was not moralized. It was necessary. When something failed, it was fixed. When someone struggled, adjustments were made. The system did not pause to explain itself. It simply continued. She remembered how often she had been told that Americans lacked ideology, that they lived only for comfort and convenience, that their lack of visible devotion was proof of emptiness. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. Perhaps devotion here had never required performance. One afternoon, as the heat thickened and shadows shortened, she found herself assigned to clean tools near the edge of the yard. The work was repetitive, the kind that allowed thought to wander if one was not careful. An older American joined her without announcement, setting his bucket beside hers. He worked with the ease of familiarity, his hands knowing the shapes before his eyes confirmed them. They stood side by side in silence for several minutes. Finally he spoke. "Hotter than yesterday." "Yes." He nodded. "Won't last. Storm coming?" She looked up at the sky, unsure how he knew. There were no clouds yet, only the wide pale blue she had come to associate with this place. "How can you tell?" she asked. He gestured vaguely. "Smell. Air's wrong." She breathed in, uncertain what she was meant to notice. The air smelled like dust and grass and something faintly metallic. He smiled barely. "You get used to it." They returned to their work. The conversation did not expand. It did not need to. The exchange carried no agenda. It was not an attempt to educate her, to correct her, to recruit her into understanding. It simply existed. She began to understand then that persuasion was not part of the machinery here. No one was trying to convince her of anything. The Americans did not argue for their way of life. They lived it. The effect was unsettling. She had been trained to defend against words, against slogans and speeches and carefully arranged displays of virtue. But how did one defend against consistency, against a system that did not react to scrutiny because it did not depend on approval? Her awakening did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated. It was there in the way meals appeared on time, regardless of mood. In the way arguments ended, not with dominance, but with resolution. In the way people spoke of tomorrow as something that could be planned for rather than feared. She saw how authority moved through the camp, not from the top down in sharp lines, but outward, diffused through trust. Instructions were given once and followed because there was no reason not to follow them. Power, she realized, did not need to shout here. It did not need to announce itself. It did not need to demand belief. It functioned. That realization carried weight. She thought again of the world she had come from, where belief had been everything and trust nothing. Where obedience was enforced because systems could not survive without constant affirmation. Where stability was simulated through spectacle. Here stability was quiet. She did not feel herself becoming American. That idea never crossed her mind. There was no surge of loyalty, no swelling emotion that replaced what had been taken from her. What changed was simpler and deeper. She stopped waiting for collapse. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the air cooled enough to draw people outside, she sat on a bench near the barracks. Across the yard, a group of Americans shared a meal, their voices overlapping in a way that suggested familiarity rather than agreement. One of them told a story that ended without a punchline. The others listened anyway. She watched their hands more than their faces. The way one passed bread without asking. The way another refilled a cup that was not his own. This was not generosity as performance. It was habit. The thought struck her with quiet force. Habits were harder to destroy than beliefs. Beliefs could be rewritten. Habits required dismantling an entire way of moving through the world. She understood then why the camp did not feel temporary in the way she had expected. It was not held together by emergency measures or wartime exception. It was an extension of something older, something practiced long before the war demanded it. She thought of the men who were missing, those working fields back home, those lost overseas, those who would never return. The absence had not stopped the system from functioning. Others had stepped in. Women, older men, teenagers. The work continued because it had to. This, she saw now, was the heart of it. Not abundance alone. Not kindness alone. Continuity. The realization did not make her happy. It made her quiet. Late that night, lying awake beneath the thin blanket, she turned the thought over again and again. She had been taught that America was young, undisciplined, morally soft, that it lacked the seriousness required to endure, and yet here it was, enduring without insisting on recognition. She did not love this country. She did not suddenly admire it in the way admiration had once been demanded of her. She understood it. Understanding came without heat or pride. It settled like a weight that could not be ignored. This was what power looked like when it did not need to prove itself. This was what authority became when it trusted its own foundations. And somewhere in that understanding, something else shifted as well. She felt for the first time since her capture not hope but steadiness, the sense that the ground beneath her, however foreign, was real. The camp lights dimmed one by one. Conversations thinned. The radio went quiet. Tomorrow would come. The system would hold, and she would wake inside it, no longer waiting for it to fail. Time did not announce itself. It slipped past in increments too small to mark meals repeating shadows, shifting routines, smoothing their edges through repetition. Days lost their sharp outlines and became something steadier, measured not by surprise but by continuity. She noticed the change one evening when she realized she could no longer remember the exact day she had arrived. The memory was still there intact, but its urgency had faded. The smell of soap, the radio, the towel by the door, those details belonged to a beginning that no longer pressed against her chest. What pressed now was something quieter, familiarity. The camp did not loosen its rules over time. If anything, it grew more precise. Schedules held. Tasks were completed. Mistakes were corrected quickly and without ceremony. Yet the longer she observed, the more she understood that discipline here did not rely on threat. No one shouted to enforce it. When work began late one morning because a truck had not arrived on time, no one panicked. The tasks were rearranged. Tools were put to use elsewhere. The delay did not become a crisis because no one needed it to be one. She watched an American supervisor explain the change with a few brief gestures and fewer words. The group nodded and adjusted. There was no resentment in the movement, no sense of humiliation at being redirected. Order was maintained not through fear, but through trust that the order itself made sense. She thought of other places she had known where authority had been reinforced by constant pressure, where rules multiplied because confidence did not, where obedience had to be displayed again and again lest it be questioned. Here, obedience was almost invisible. She noticed it in the way people lined up without being told, in the way tools were returned to the same place each evening, in the way conversations paused naturally when something required attention, then resumed without irritation. There was no theater to it. One afternoon, a disagreement broke out near the supply area. Two Americans stood facing the same crate, each convinced it belonged elsewhere. Their voices rose slightly, not in anger, but in insistence. She tensed instinctively, waiting for escalation. It never came. A third man approached, listened briefly, then pointed to a ledger resting on a nearby table. One of the men checked it, nodded once, and the crate was moved. The matter ended there. No one lost face. She felt something loosen inside her chest at the sight, though she did not yet understand why. As weeks passed, she became more aware of how little space there was for humiliation here. Correction happened, but it was narrow, specific, and complete. It did not spill outward to define the person who had erred. A mistake was a mistake. Nothing more. She realized that this absence of public shaming was not accidental. It was structural. The system did not require people to feel small in order to function. In fact, it seemed to rely on the opposite, that people remain capable, unbroken, able to continue. This was not softness. It was efficiency. She thought often of unity, though she did not use the word. What she observed was alignment rather than agreement. People did not need to think the same way to act in the same direction. They shared enough ground to move forward together. She saw it in the shared meals where conversation drifted easily across differences without trying to resolve them, in the way people disagreed without drawing lines that could not be crossed again. No one spoke of being united. They simply were. The realization unsettled her more than overt displays of cohesion ever could. Unity without declaration was harder to challenge. It left no surface to attack. She wondered how long this had been true. Long before the war, she suspected. In the evenings, when the day's work gave way to rest, she found herself watching the Americans more closely than the guards ever watched her. She noted the way tiredness was acknowledged but not dramatized, the way people leaned on one another without comment, the way absence of men overseas of sons and brothers was carried quietly without becoming a weapon. Grief existed here. She could see it in the pauses that lingered too long in the letters folded carefully and tucked away. But grief did not fracture the whole. It coexisted with purpose. She imagined this version of America extending beyond the fence, into towns where factories ran through the night, onto farms where work continued without those who had once done it, into kitchens where meals were shared, rationed perhaps, but still expected to arrive. She did not romanticize it. She could see the cost written in tired faces and careful movements, but she could also see what held it together. Trust. Not blind trust. Not sentimental trust. The practical kind earned through repetition reinforced by outcome. The trust that if you showed up and did your part, the system would hold. She thought of the slogans she had grown up with, the promises that demanded belief first and proof later. Here, belief seemed almost irrelevant. Proof arrived daily in small, unremarkable forms. The comparison formed itself without effort. She did not name it, she did not need to. She simply knew that this place would stay with her long after she left it. Not the fences, not the uniforms. This version of America, the one that did not announce itself, that did not require affirmation, that functioned quietly, even under strain. She would remember how discipline had felt without violence, how authority had moved without humiliation, how people had trusted one another enough to share responsibility rather than hoard control. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the light softened the hard edges of the camp, she sat alone on the steps of the barracks. The radio played somewhere in the distance, its sound barely reaching her now. Laughter drifted across the yard, then faded. She felt a tightening in her chest, not pain exactly, but something close to it. This was a moment she knew she would revisit, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was not. Years from now, she would struggle to explain it to others. How nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything had changed. How the memory she carried was not of a single kindness, but of a sustained way of being. She would not speak of America as a savior. She would not speak of it as flawless. She would speak of it as stable, as a place where systems mattered more than speeches, where people believed in continuity enough to invest in it daily, where unity did not require uniformity. The thought made her both grateful and sad. Grateful to have seen it. Sad because she knew without knowing why that such versions of countries were fragile, that they depended on habits passed quietly from one generation to the next, that once broken they would be difficult to rebuild. The light faded. The steps cooled beneath her hands. She stood and went inside, carrying the knowledge with her not as judgment, not as longing, but as reference. Whatever came next in her life, this would be the measure against which she weighed it. She would remember this America. She left America without ceremony. There were no speeches, no parting gestures meant to linger. The gates opened. Names were called. Papers were checked. The process unfolded with the same quiet efficiency that had governed everything else. When it was her turn, she stepped forward carrying the same small bag she had arrived with, though it felt heavier now, not with possessions, but with memory. The ship carried her back across the ocean she had crossed in fear. This time, the water did not feel endless. It felt measured, crossable. Germany received her in fragments. Buildings stood where others had collapsed. Streets bore names she recognized but no longer trusted. People moved through the ruins with practiced restraint, rebuilding without optimism, surviving, without illusion. Hunger was not dramatic here. It was constant. It shaped days the way weather once had. She returned to what remained of her family with hands that had grown stronger and eyes that had learned to see differently. They asked her questions. What was it like? How were you treated? Were you afraid? She answered carefully. She did not describe the fences. She did not describe the guards. She spoke instead of mornings that began on time, of work that mattered, of food that arrived because systems existed to deliver it, of people who did not need to be cruel to feel secure. Some listened, others could not. Years passed. The war receded into dates and anniversaries, into photographs placed on shelves and uniforms folded away. New arguments replaced old ones. New certainties demanded allegiance. She carried her memory quietly. When her children were born, she fed them without comment, making sure there was always enough. When they asked why she insisted on finishing repairs rather than replacing what was broken, she told them that things lasted longer when people took responsibility for them. When they were older and asked about the war, she did not speak of victory or defeat. She spoke of restraint. She told them that not every triumph announced itself with noise, that some of the most consequential victories occurred without witnesses and decisions made repeatedly day after day to treat others as capable rather than expendable. Her children listened in the way children do, half understanding, half absorbing tone rather than content. Her grandchildren listened differently. They asked about America. She paused before answering. She did not praise it. She did not defend it. She described it. She described a place where power had not needed to humiliate, where discipline had existed without violence, where people trusted systems enough to place themselves inside them. She told them that she had been a prisoner there and had learned something she could not have learned anywhere else, that strength did not require cruelty, that abundance did not require arrogance, that dignity could be extended without being diminished. Sometimes, years later, she received letters. They came from places she recognized only faintly, small towns, names once spoken casually by men she had worked beside. The letters were polite, unassuming, often brief. They thanked her for surviving. They thanked her for remembering. She answered when she could, her handwriting slower now, her words simpler. She never wrote of gratitude without context. She wrote of treatment, of being seen, of being allowed to remain whole. She understood as time narrowed her days that history would compress everything, that the war would become lessons and lessons would become slogans. She hoped something would remain beneath that compression, that those who came after would remember that there had once been a version of power that did not shout, that there had been a country confident enough to treat its enemies as people and strong enough to do so without apology. She never forgot how she had been treated. And because she did not forget, neither would those who listened to her, not as nostalgia, not as myth, but as inheritance.